EVS web seminar. We hope that there will be an ongoing series on different topics, but this is the first, and we've been working on this for a while. So I'm looking forward to what will be happening here today. So we have an interesting panel combining two scholars who've done interesting research, which is, complementary in exemplary ways. So we're very fortunate, I think, to have both interesting presentations, and I'm sure we'll have an interesting conversation on these topics today. So the first presenter is Frédéric Gonthier, who's a professor at Sciences Po Grenoble, and he does work in political sociology, values and attitudes, and in particular, in terms of economic and cultural beliefs. And he's done more recent studies on party politics and political values and polarization, which are, of course, some of the key topics that we'll be talking about today. So welcome very much, Frédéric. The other presenter is Dr. Marlene Mauk, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the GESIS Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences, and she's a former interim professor at the University of Münster. And she's done research on political culture, public attitudes in the context of democracy and autocracy, political values orientations, and political trust. And she'll also, be speaking to the key topics of this theme today on values, polarization, and cultural backlash. So welcome very much to you, Marlene. Just a few practicalities. We'll try to have this as an interactive process. So rather than me reading your questions, we'll try to moderate so that your mic will be opened and you can ask your questions after the two presentations. If you, for some reason, have problems using the microphone or don't want to, you can write a question in the chat, and I will keep an eye on the chat, and then I'll read your question to whomever you indicate the question is directed to. So with those out of the way, we'll have two 20-25-minute presentations, and then we'll open for debate. And trying to bridge those papers and engage with some of the topics brought forward in them. So, Frédéric, I leave the floor to you.
Okay, good. I assume you do. Okay, so first of all, let me thank Vera, Natalia, and Morten for giving me the opportunity to present this piece that was co-authored with Tristan Guerra, a political scientist also based in Grenoble. And it's a pleasure to be here and to break the ice of this first EVS webinar, a collective event, well appreciated in these hard times. So my talk will be organized as follows. I will begin with some elements of definition for those who are not familiar with how the issue of polarization is framed in political science, and then I will present the research puzzle and some of the hypotheses we addressed in the paper, and after that I will move on to the methodology, data and modeling strategy, and then the substantial results, and in closing I will recap the main findings and discuss some of the often overlooked effect of party polarization. In sociology, political conflicts, social conflicts are usually conceptualized as revolving around economic and cultural cleavages. Yet, the extent to which one dimension prevails over the other has long been debated in social sciences. On the one side, you have the proponents of the new politics approach, and basically they argue that cultural issues have replaced economic issues as the primary driver of political competition. And on the other side, you have more nuanced scholars who recall that even though cultural claims tend to become more salient, economic issues continue to play a key role, so that both conflicts are somewhat encapsulated into the left-right divide, which operates much like an overarching dimension. Still, the two approaches agree on one fact, which is that political competition influences the way individuals organize their beliefs and value systems, which begs the issue of how Europeans organize their beliefs and value systems when faced with party polarization and when faced with possible increasing party polarization. To be clear, party polarization can be defined as the ideological differentiation among political parties. So this alludes to two things. The first one is the ideological homogeneity within each party for both economic and cultural issues, and the other one is ideological distance between parties. The topic of party polarization has garnered a lot of academic scrutiny in the last decade. Some scholars claim that high levels of party polarization stir up ideological debates. Party polarization antagonizes partisan groups which are unable to find common ground. Others develop a more positive outlook, and they contend that the greater the level of party polarization, the more citizens are likely to receive clear elite cues, clear political cues, emphasizing ideological differences between parties. So as a result, polarized party systems may well improve the extent to which voters can connect party ideological stances with their own, especially among the most politically sophisticated individuals who are known to pay more attention to politics. Likewise, increasing party polarization may well intensify partisan sorting, with citizens more inclined to grow strong partisan attachments, as well as align their policy preferences with party positions. So the rationale behind this line of arguing is that party polarization increases ideological constraints on policy preferences. So when party stances are clear, when party stances are easy to distinguish from one another, citizens are more likely to organize their political attitudes and behaviors consistently. Still, the relationship between party polarization and belief systems remains, let's say, an overlooked issue in the literature. To better make sense of this issue, one needs to reel in the seminal definition of belief system as a set of functionally interdependent party issue positions. So belief systems, simply put, they imply ideological constraints. And this notion of constraints refers to the way the components of a belief system, say economic and cultural attitudes, whether they are and the extent to which they are related to one another. And a very famous political scientist, John Converse, makes a clear distinction between what he calls vertical and horizontal constraints. So horizontal constraints point to the correlations among specific issue positions within one issue domain. For instance, the interdependence between views on the economy, between different views on the economy. And by contrast, vertical constraints can be defined as the degree to which specific attitudes are driven by more general orientations, such as issue domains, values, or political ideology. For instance, the correspondence between economic and cultural attitudes, or between economic attitudes and political ideology. It's also key to bear in mind that consistency, at least in political science, takes the form of an alignment with the prevalent left-right scale. So this idea is based on the premise that ordinary citizens, they align their ideology with the dominant framing of the political debate. So basically, the idea is that the mass public will mirror the ways in which political parties and political elite frame economic and cultural issues, meaning along a continuum ranging from the most conservative to the most progressive. So this issue of ideological constraint immediately raises another issue, which is the comparability between European party systems. In most party families have similar positions on economic and cultural issues. This means that economic and cultural issues are usually encapsulated in a unidimensional divide, left versus right, conservative versus progressive. Yet, we also know that the basis of party competition, they differ a lot between Western and Eastern Europe. And we know from the literature that party families and voters who at the same time embrace opposition to global capitalism and opposition to cosmopolitan values, they are much more widespread in Central and East Europe. So this means that supporting progressive views on both economic and cultural issues or conservative views on both economic and cultural issues, it is not a standard pattern of consistency throughout Europe. So with this in mind, one can also argue that when addressing the issue of ideological consistency, it's best to assess the economic and cultural dimensions separately. And one other issue to have in mind is that ideological consistency is closely related to political competence. It is usually assumed that most citizens are innocent of ideology in that they exhibit limited levels of coherence in their political beliefs. By contrast, the politically sophisticated are more prone to organize their beliefs ideologically. We know that the most sophisticated citizens, they receive more political cues, they pay more attention to political cues, and on top of that, they are more motivated and they are more capable of using these cues as efficient. So it results from that only a small part of sophisticated citizens is likely to align with the elite standards and is likely to arrange their policy preferences fully in tune with the progressive versus conservative polarity. So all in all, one can assume that in highly polarized environments, in highly polarized party systems, citizens are more likely to receive a rich supply of coherent and distinctive party cues or political cues. And the more citizens will follow these party cues, the more they will come to hold policy preferences that are tightly organized around the left-right continuum. From this, it follows the assumption that party polarization is likely to foster ideological consistency. To put it simply, in countries where party stances are very homogeneous, in countries where party stances are distinct from each other, citizens will be more prone to consistently align their policy preferences with the left-right polarity. And the second hypothesis that we try to gauge in this piece is that the pressure induced by party polarization, the pressure toward ideological consistency, is not confined to those citizens who are more politically sophisticated. When policy options are clearly organized, when policy options are clearly separated from each other, one can argue that those with low or middle levels of political sophistication, they will also pay more attention and they will also respond consistently to the corresponding political cues. So greater party polarization will result in more tightly organized belief systems for all citizens. Okay, so I'm done with this long introduction and notions that may seem rather abstract to some of you. So let's move on to the data, methodology, and modeling. The analysis is based on the 20 that are available in the last EVS round to measure economic and cultural issues within a perimeter of 30 countries. So here is the full list of items that were coded to range from the most conservative to the most progressive view. To make sense of how these views are organized, to make sense of their functional interdependence, we conducted a type of analysis which is called correlation class analysis. So I will try to be brief and set technique aside to let the results speak out. So basically, CCA is an extension of relation class analysis, a statistical technique which aims to partition a population into classes of individuals who share similar patterns of relationships among pairs of response. It's usually, it has been widely used in sociology to address how cultural preferences are combined. So basically, for you to get the idea, CCA clusters individuals when their attitudes are identical, meaning when they are the exact same or the exact inverse of each other, or when these attitudes are uniformly more extreme and or uniformly more positive than those of their counterparts. CCA does not cluster individuals holding similar policy preferences, by contrast with confirmatory factorial analysis, for example. Rather, it will group together individuals who exhibit very distinctive patterns of associations, positive, whether positive or negative, meaning that individuals who express opposite preferences but match the same underlying patterns are positioned in the same categories, since the interrelations between their preferences are identically organized. So here you have an example with three clusters, A, B, C. The first one is those who are omni versus those who are univore in terms of cultural consumption. And the second pattern opposes those who have highbrow versus lowbrow patterns of cultural consumption, and so on. So when this type of analysis is applied to the EVS items that I presented early on, we get two very distinct belief systems, meaning that respondents assigned to each cluster used similar principles for organizing, for structuring their economic and cultural views. So simply put, individuals for each cluster yield similar patterns of association between their economic and cultural beliefs. Okay, so here is the one, two clusters, and the figure you have here presents the belief networks in the upper panel and the correlograms in the lower panels, which plots the strengths and the direction of the association. So it provides an overview of the correlations between and within issue domains. So here you have the first clusters, the first cluster, which brings together Europeans who consistently will associate progressive economic views with progressive cultural views, and vice versa, the other way around. So more specifically, what you can see here is that with the exception of economic competition and tolerance to income inequalities, all economic items are positively correlated with cultural items, with coefficients ranging from 0.02 to 0.26, something like that. So unsurprisingly, correlations within each issue domain are greater than correlations between different issue domains. So since the respondents from this cluster display high or somewhat high levels of constraints along the left-right continuum, they can be referred to as ideologues. And the second cluster, you can see by contrasting the two, and the second cluster consists of respondents for whom economically progressive views are only weakly correlated with culturally progressive views, or for whom the two are negatively correlated. So it is notably the case for economic liberalism, universalism, and gender tolerance. So even though they do not show a complete lack of consistency, especially within their cultural attitudes, we use the term non-ideologues to characterize this cluster of respondents. One short side note, as expected, non-ideologues are overrepresented in Central and Eastern Europe, while ideologues are overrepresented in Western Europe. I'll come back to this issue, but this result is in line with studies showing that in Eastern Europe, economic and cultural attitudes are only loosely correlated due to the dual transition from communism to democracy and capitalism, to put it bluntly. Next, to measure party polarization, we used one of the most comprehensive sources on party stances, namely the Manifesto Project, which is an expert survey where party platforms, party programs, party manifestos are coded by experts. So more specifically, we retrieved the values of party positions on economic and sociocultural issues. The major interest of the Manifesto's project for our purpose is that the policy issues that we can select them so that they closely match the items coming from the EVS. And then to make sense of how these party stances were polarized, we applied the famous formula from Dalton of party polarization. Basically, to be brief, this formula allows measures to the dispersion of parties along the progressive versus conservative scale for economic and cultural issues. And it is key to note that this formula captures two components of party polarization: ideological homogeneity within each party and ideological distance between parties along the progressive v conservative scale. So based on that, we computed four scores at the country level, one for party polarization on economic issues, the second one for party polarization on cultural issues, and the third score we computed is the form of an additive index. So party polarization on economic plus cultural issues. And we also computed a typology variable combining high and low levels of economic and cultural party polarization. And of course, to be sure, we cross-validated the explanatory variable with alternative measurements of party positions. So quickly turning to the modeling strategy. In the paper, we performed different multi-level logistic regression, and the baseline model takes the cluster assignment from the CCA as a binary dependent variable. So the probability of being clustered as an ideologue versus the probability of being clustered as a non-ideologue. And the major independent variable is party polarization at the country level. And the additional variable is political sophistication, which consists here of a score that was derived from a confirmatory factor analysis on political interest, importance of politics in personal life, and political participation. So at the individual level, we controlled for education, sex, age, income groups, economic hardship, attendance to religious service, and party closeness. And at the country level, we control for institutional factors that are likely to bear an effect on party polarization and that can influence the relationship between party polarization and ideological consistency. That is the effective number of parties and an index of voting disproportionality to account for the fact that parliamentary regimes are less divisive than majoritarian democracies with, like, say, winner-takes-all politics. We also control for socioeconomic factors that are likely to exert an effect on cross-country variations, and therefore control for the Human Development Index in its adjusted for inequality declination, and we also included the gross enrollment ratio for tertiary school. And that's the baseline model, and I will show you additional models that go one step further, where we computed cross-level interactions between political sophistication and party polarization, including a random slope on political sophistication. So now moving on to the results. As we found that when electoral and socioeconomic characteristics are controlled for, the probability of respondents classifying as ideologues rises significantly as party polarization increases on both issues. So as you see here, more specifically, one standard deviation increase in party polarization increases the probability of being clustered as an ideologue by 70%. And we also plotted the mean predicted values for party polarization at the country level. Here we separate regression lines for Eastern and Western Europe to better evidence the fact and to be sure that party polarization is influential in both Eastern and Western Europe. And as you can see here, there is a large percentage increase in average probabilities within the two regions. So this pattern applies whether we use the additive index of polarization on economic and cultural issues, or whether we use each dimension of party polarization separately. And it also applies when we use the typology variable, and it shows that the probability of being ideologues is more than 2.5 times higher in country with high economic and high sociocultural polarization compared to country with low economic and cultural polarization. So put together, these results, they lend some strong support to the assumption that when party systems are dispersed along the left-right continuum, Europeans are more inclined to consistently structure their policy views along the same continuum. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we included interaction terms between party polarization and political sophistication. And we found also the hypothesis that party polarization enhances consistency in belief systems for individuals of all sophistication level. So this pattern, as you can see here, is corroborated when party polarization is on economic and sociocultural issues are also included in the models. So as you can see here, there are large gaps between the most politically aware and the least politically aware, meaning that the most politically aware are more consistent than their least aware counterpart. These gaps remain steady as party polarization increases. This means that greater party polarization benefits all citizens, all Europeans, regardless of their level of political sophistication. So all in all, our results substantiate the claim that citizens experiencing highly polarized political environments are more responsive to progressive versus conservative cues that are embedded in the political and the elite discourse. And this turned out to be, let's say, an overlooked and perhaps a valuable consequence of party polarization. So when elite cues become clearer, the citizenry as a whole manages to catch up and to respond by adjusting their policy preferences accordingly in a more consistent fashion. This is also interesting if you have in mind the so-called cross-pressure voters, whose attitudes are not fully in line with the left-right continuum, and have received a lot of attention from political scientists and scholars, usually claim that radical right parties have managed to cater to these cross-pressure voters holding left authoritarian values, and radical right parties have combined conservative position on cultural issues and immigration. They've combined that with the defense of national welfare and economic grievances of the working class to appeal to cross-pressure voters. And interestingly, what the results suggest is that when political competition fosters ideological consistency, when party polarization fosters ideological consistency, it may well end up with reducing the reservoir of cross-pressure voters that radical parties are likely to appeal to. And I'm done.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. So that was really exciting and a provocative thought to end on, that polarization might, in the end, actually be a beneficial political consequence. Before we move into the discussion of these findings, Dr. Marlene Mauk, you have a presentation which speaks to some of these same topics, though from a different perspective. So I yield the floor to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Morten. And you should all be seeing my screen now, right?
Yep.
Perfect. So even though it doesn't have polarization in the title, I think it actually does speak a lot to Frédéric's results as well. So I'm presenting today a paper that's titled Rebuilding Trust in Broken System, and it deals with the relationship between the success of populist parties and citizens' trust in their democratic institutions. Just briefly on the background of this paper, I don't need to discuss this here. We all know that there's been a rise of populist parties basically all over Europe in the past couple of decades. And at the same time, and you may have seen the recent VDEM report on this as well, we've had a lot of democratic recessions again in European democracies. But unlike the rise of populist parties, this hasn't happened everywhere in Europe. So some countries are actually remarkably stable in their democratic quality. And so the question that provides basically the starting point for my paper is whether populist parties are actually a danger for democracy. And as someone with a political culture background, if I speak of danger for democracy, what I think of is, do populist parties somehow change citizens' attitudes towards the political system in a way that could be problematic for the system? And there's some evidence that this is in fact the case. As we know, is that populists propel political cynicism, and especially voters of populist parties are less trusting of the democratic institutions. And at the same time, those who are less trusting of politics, they also tend to vote for populist parties. So we do have quite strong indications, at least on the individual level, that there is a vicious circle of populism, distrust, and then again populism. On a macro level, however, there's some recent evidence that this might not be the case on a macro level. So we find, or Atle Haugsgaard finds, that in Norway at least, when the Fremskrittspartiet, the radical right populist party there, came into power, that actually increased satisfaction with democracy among their supporters at least. And so what I'm asking more generally is, in this paper, is how does the success of populist parties affect political trust? So I'm really talking about the success of those parties, so not just their existence or voting for those parties, but them actually being successful in the electoral arena. What does it do to political trust among the general public? And the basic idea here is that, yeah, of course, populists being populist parties, so by definition, they are anti-establishment and anti-system. So they spread messages that are potentially undermining the trustworthiness of the political system. And also prior research has found that this populist message does elicit more negative views of the political system, at least among the supporters of those parties. And more generally, that anti-system messages, regardless of where they're coming from, they can lead to more negative views of the political system as well. So if we think about the success of populist parties, we would expect that this also increases the coverage and also the legitimacy of this populist anti-system message. And so we would expect it again to elicit more negative views among citizens. And because they are more exposed to and also more likely to believe this message if those parties are more successful. Yet there is an argument to the contrary that we can make here. And the first part of this argument is that, yeah, populist party success, despite spreading perhaps their message more, can also make the system appear more responsive, because now obviously the system has been able to include a new strand of political demands, so it's more responsive than it was before, perhaps. And also, as representation of interests, both actual and perceived representation has been found to generate trust in the political system. Again, if populist parties become successful, their supporters, those who actually have the same interests that those parties advocate, they might feel their interests being more represented, so they should, again, increase trust in the system. And there's a second part of this argument, that's that populist party success can actually revitalize the political discourse and mobilize those citizens who are committed to liberal democracy, and also sort of motivate established parties to fight for democracy much more than they did before, because now with the rise of populist parties, both the established parties and citizens might see that their democratic system to be more in danger than it was before. So we see some sort of backlash effect from the more liberal side of the system. And so I actually expect that those trust generating effects, they outweigh the effects, the negative effects of the spread of the populist party message. And so I expect, in terms of the main effect of populist party success, is that it increases political trust in the general public rather than decreases it. And in addition to this main effect, I also expect this effect to be moderated by certain system characteristics. Why is that the case? Well, if we think of populist parties as being someone that's come in to sort of correct problems with the existing political system, then this seems much more plausible if the system actually had some problems before. So if there is more reason to think, okay, we need an outsider to come in to fix those problems, and there is actual room for improvement. And so I expect the effect of populist party success to be much stronger in countries where democratic quality is lacking, where corruption is high, and where government performance is low. And particularly, I use data not from the European Value Study, but from the European Social Survey. I use 8 waves from 2002 to 2016 to look at changes in political trust on the aggregate level. And I look at trust in parliament, trust in parties, and trust in politicians. And I relate them. Again, this is all done on the aggregate level because the ESS is not a panel study. I relate them to populist party successes, which is measured as gains in vote shares. And this is taken from the PALGOV data. And I identify the populist parties, both right-wing and left-wing parties, from the populist. And then I use VDEM and World Bank data to measure my moderating variables. So obviously you look at only democracies, and I look at only countries that were featured in at least 3 ESS rounds, and only at countries that have at least one successful populist party. And by successful, I mean they gained at least one parliamentary seat in at least one of those elections. And at least me with 23 countries in Europe that have 125 country rounds, because trust in parties for some reason wasn't queried in the first round of the ESS. We lose 12 countries for the first for this for trust in parties, so it's only 107 there. I also run a number of robustness checks. I'm not going to go into details here, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have on that. Just to illustrate what countries and parties I look at and which I consider as populist parties, you can see here the list of both the right-wing and the left-wing populist parties, and you can see there's a much more right-wing populist parties in Europe than left-wing populist parties. But there's actually countries like Cyprus or Ireland that only have left-wing populist parties as well. And there's also countries like Iceland or Portugal that don't have any populist party. As I said before, I exclude those in my main analysis, but just to show you where actually we find populist parties and where we don't find them. So turning to the results for the main effect, you can see here three different sets of models with the three dependent variables, so trust in parliament, trust in parties, and trust in politicians. And the interesting effect is the top one, so that's populist party vote gains. And we can see, depending on the model specification and what I include as control variables, this effect is significant, or it's just not statistically significant, but what we can see here is that it's always positive. So trust is always higher when so trust becomes higher as it changes in trust when populist parties gain in votes. So yeah, we find actual support for the first hypothesis that populist party success increases trust in the general public. And we also find support for the idea that this is dependent on the actual system characteristics. So for example, here we have democratic quality. You can see that in each of those graphs, again, 3 graphs because of 3 different dependent variables. We can see that the positive effect of populist party success on political trust is stronger in countries on the left-hand side of the spectrum. So that's countries with lower democratic quality. I mean, arguably, there's only a few countries in Europe that have fairly low democratic quality, but we can see that for them, the effect is much stronger. While in fact, for countries that have high democratic quality, we don't see any effect of populist party success. And this looks very similar if you look at corruption control, and also if you look at economic performance or government performance in general. So just to conclude and wrap this up, the first interesting results I found is that contrary to the micro-level relationship, which is clearly that voting or supporting populist party is related to lower political trust, on a macro level, the success of populist parties actually seems to increase political trust, at least in the short run. And this effect is particularly pronounced, as I expected, in countries with lacking democratic quality, rampant corruption, and low government performance. So my results actually do support this sort of corrective force perspective. Populist parties, once they are successful at least, or once they're more or less integrated in the political system, can be seen potentially as a corrective force for citizens. There's of course a bunch of limitations to these study or avenues for future research. So this is purely observational and cross-sectional data. So there is nothing in terms of causal identification here. And there's obviously more work to be done here. The other big question mark is, of course, what is the actual individual level relationship here? How do citizens on the individual level react to populist party success? As I said before, the ESS is not a panel study, so I can't do anything on the individual level. And also it would be super interesting to see whether the reactions to populist party success differs between different groups of citizens. For example, obviously supporters of populist parties and supporters of other parties might potentially have different reactions to the success of those parties. And then again, I hinted before in the argument on that this also could have to do with the reaction of the established parties. So what are they actually doing in response to populist party success, for example, and also does it matter for how citizens then react to this? So for example, would the inclusion in coalition governments yield different responses from the general public than sort of as we have in Germany with the right-wing populist party, like there's no cooperation stance from the established parties. And as I said that just now, my results speak to the short term. we don't really know much about the long-term effects of a populist party success. So, for example, I mean, and I don't even want to go into the very likely detrimental effects to the institutional structure of democracies that populists in power could have, but it might also have very bad effects on citizens' attitudes as well if they, for example, after a while realize, okay, those populist parties, they're not really delivering on their promises either, and they're not really making the system better and so on. So that could also lead to a decline in trust after a couple of years' time. Nonetheless, and this is the sort of provocative question for the discussion here, do we have maybe even reason for optimism? Is populist party success not as bad as we might think it is? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlene, for another very interesting presentation. Very nice. And I think these speak very, very nicely to each other, the two papers. So I think we should open for discussion. Please raise your hand in Zoom, and I'll identify you in the participants panel and take you as you show up. So Bogdan, you're first with a question.
Thank you. Thank for the nice presentation. Both presenters were quite okay, and they put us to think about many things. And I have, first of all, a common question for both of them, because in both presentations, it's something that triggered my attention in the same way, and it's time related. In particular, in Marlene's presentation, in her argument on the first hypothesis, she was repeating short-term, long-term effects. And I wonder what happens if she adds the time independent variable within the models, meaning that from the time of, from the moment of elections, when you measure the gain in votes for populist parties, and the moment when the surveyor collected, the period of time in different countries and in different waves of the ESS are different, meaning that you have a lot of variations over there. So you can test actually the effects that the changes in trust in the three different variables with this kind of variable. And then you can also go to lag effects, meaning that you may observe effects of changes in the previous elections, meaning not only the most recent ones, but the ones which are before the most recent ones, because maybe you have a long-term effect. This was your argument about long-term effects and short-term effects. And somehow the same situation and the time question may go to Fred as well, but in a different way, because in Fred's case, I wonder about causality. I wonder what comes first, the capacity of elite to polarize the ideas within the parties, or actually the separation in ideologue and non-ideologue within the population. And I wonder if you plan to measure, to apply the same correlation class analysis in different waves of different surveys, or in EVS if you can, and check what happens in time. That's for the moment. That's all for the moment.
So Marlene, if you'll maybe answer first.
Sure, yeah, thanks for the suggestion, Bogdan. I haven't done it, so I can't really say anything on the results, but it's a good suggestion and definitely worth looking at. I'm a bit skeptical of lagged effects, because of course, if I have another election in between, then it might be difficult to disentangle what happened when and because of what. But yeah, it's definitely worth trying this out. Thank you.
You control. You may control for both of them and see what happens after you take.
I don't have an infinite number of cases, but yeah.
Yeah, if I may follow up on this correlation or causality issues. Okay, I have two ways of answering your concern, Bogdan. The first one is to say that it was impossible due to data constraints. If we want to address this issue in the long run with the EVS data, we have to face the fact that we don't have all the items for all the EVS rounds, so it becomes really impossible to address technically. And the same goes at the macro level with the expert surveys, for which the years when the party manifestos are coded do not exactly match the years when the data are collected. So addressing this in the long run is really very complicated. This is why we decided to investigate party polarization through only a cross-sectional lens. But this way we address the let's say the structural component of party polarization. So we address the effect of long-lasting political cultures and the effects of entrenched political cleavages. That's the first answer. The second will probably be more satisfying to you, Bogdan. In political science, we are quite confident that the linkage between party systems and belief systems does not go both ways. Okay, citizens they interpret politics by mirroring elite frames. In turns, parties respond to patterns of voter preference. However, much of the literature suggests that when political elites have to bind policy issues together, when political elites combine economic and cultural issues, they do not look at how citizens combine these issues. They look at what? They look at party competition. So the elite are much more driven by party competition than by the way citizens perceive these issues. So it is usually assumed in political science that the public take cues from the elite rather than the other way around. The public takes cues from the elite rather than the elite taking cues from the public, at least in terms of how values are combined. Okay.
All right, thank you very much. Marcus, you have a question?
Yeah, right. Thanks for seeing that, Morten, and thanks to both presenters. Excellent presentations. I'm not sure, I haven't had enough time to digest all this, probably. I maybe have a slight suggestion to Frédéric about terminology. How you use ideology and polarization. I'm not sure if this is really like in keeping with what, for example, Philip Converse meant. I mean, he's defining ideology as something that is coherent, and I think that means substantively coherent in the way that people can make meaningful connections between the components of their belief systems, if you want, in a philosophical way, with some logic behind that, etc. And then we have an ideology. I'm not sure if your measurement of the ideology of voters is really up to that. It's of course extremely difficult to measure that. But if I understand the exercise correctly, the method, it's basically a clustering method that is showing like what goes with what empirically, but there's no substantive consistency checked, of course. And the problem with that could be that you are basically measuring only polarization on the voter side again, on the participants side. They are clustered, but they are not necessarily consistent with how they are clustered. Maybe they are just following the cues from the elites in the clusters they use. And to work against this, maybe you would want to really talk also about the content of their belief systems a bit more, as you cannot come up with a full causal testing design with these data. That's impossible. Maybe you need to go into the really content side and check what is in these ideologies, and maybe think about what the background factors for like the clusters are that you're finding together, which you have had no time to talk about. Maybe it's all there, but that was a suggestion I wanted to make.
Okay, I get your point, Marcus. It's an interesting question. Let me answer by saying that the CCA is somewhat agnostic in the sense that the algorithm does not make any a priori assumption as regards to how the preferences are organized. And what we end up with is two clusters of respondents who yield similar and yet opposite patterns of associations between the variables analyzed. And then we look at these two patterns and we find that one is consistent in the expected terms, like policy issues consistently combined, and the other is not. So there is no a priori assumption, but an happy result.
Yeah, thanks. That was what I was understanding, and therefore my suggestion to look into what the patterns you get really and try to interpret them.
All right, thank you very much for this exchange. Ricardo, you have a question as well?
Yes, thank you. So I have a question to Marlene. It's nice to see you, even though online and not in person, but whatever. I found your argument very interesting, this relationship between the success of populist parties at the macro level and its positive effect on political trust. So I have a question or a clarification, whether if you have tested longitudinally, whether the increase in the success of a populist party between one point and another, so one round and another, if the increase of the success of the percentage of vote for a populist party has actually increased also political trust. Because I think that also within each country you can see whether and test longitudinally, whether the evolution of the performance of populist party, whether they have increased the political trust. And we know, for instance, by looking at certain countries in which we know that we had an increase of the success in populist parties in the recent years, even though there is not an increase as well in the overall level of political trust. So I would like to ask you whether you have considered also this, so whether considering the difference between one point and another in the performance of those parties, and I think that if you didn't do it, I think it could be an evolution and a further evidence toward your argument. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. So good seeing you again. Yeah, thanks also for that suggestion. I haven't actually done it. I mean, of course, because the way this is modeled, it implicitly also uses the variance within countries, but I haven't explicitly modeled within country changes. So yeah, that's a good thing. I will try that as well.
All right, thank you very much. Frédéric, you have a question? You need to turn on your mic.
Yep, sorry. I have a question not to myself, but to Marlene. Well, two comments. I was a bit left angry with what you first presented as expected differences between left wing populist parties and right-wing populist parties. So do you have any results showing differences between left-wing and right-wing radical voters? And on a more theoretical note, how do you account for the fact that populist voters are supportive of democratic innovations, are supportive of reforms that aim at either deepening democracy for radical left populist voters, or that aim at establishing more control and more punishment over the political elites for right populist voters. So my point is that populism is not against democracy per se. Populism is more against liberal democracy, or the way the political elite make their way through a certain view and certain democratic institutions.
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Fred. I've actually looked at right-wing populist parties and left-wing populist parties separately as well, and the results are very similar. They are much, I mean, the statistical power is much weaker for the left-wing populists because I just have so much fewer parties here. So there isn't really much, but it goes in the same direction for both types of populist parties, actually. And the other question, yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't necessarily see populist parties as anti-democratic, but they are clearly anti the existing system. And so for my dependent variable, which is political trust in the existing institutions, and especially, I mean, I deliberately picked parties and politicians because that's what the populist message is often very critical of. I mean, they're always talking about, oh, the elites, and they are like, they're not us. And so I think that, yes, populist parties aren't necessarily anti-democratic. I mean, I guess some of them have some anti-democratic stances, but they are, and I would say by definition, against the existing liberal democratic system. I actually have a question back to Fred, if
you allow me a quick follow-up
Sure.
to what you say. One way of controlling for that would be to control for satisfaction with democracy, to make sure that you do not conflate populist voters with dissatisfied Democrats.
Sorry, I didn't catch the first half of what you said.
One way you could control for satisfaction with democracy in the models to be sure that your populist voting variable does not conflate populist voters and dissatisfied Democrats, which we know from the literature that they present very different profiles.
Yeah, that's a good idea. What I actually did was use satisfaction with democracy as an alternative dependent variable. That just looks very similar, actually. The question I had for you, and that's just really a detail, but I think I noticed from your graph that you don't actually have that much variation in Western Europe regarding party polarization. I think you have like 3 outliers, and the other ones are all really clustered together. So I was wondering, is that like a problem for your results, perhaps? Because it seems to be driven mainly by those outliers in Western Europe.
Yeah, we control for that. We have some cases that could be either outliers or suspicious cases, like for example Armenia, where the coding of parties and party manifesto can be very problematic. So we're a bit unsure about the quality of the data at the macro level. But then we made robustness checks, and we tested the models without these outliers, and the results are substantially the same.
Sorry, just one more tiny question, because you just mentioned Armenia. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I think Armenia isn't classified as a democracy by most indices. Is there? I don't know what other countries you had in there. Did you make any difference between democracies and non-democracies?
No, because we expect that party polarization, especially if you take the cleavages one by one, or the issue dimensions one by one, we expect the effects are the same whether in democracy or not. We expect that whatever the type of the regime, there is a boost toward more ideological consistency.
All right, thank you very much. These are really interesting and provocative papers, I think, right? So reading two papers presenting both that polarization and populism is both factors that may be beneficial to democracy and political conversation is provocative but helpful thought. So I have a question for both of you, and I'll encourage you to speculate here, right? So I think both your papers and your presentations somehow argue that these are factors that invigorate and empower political processes in one way or the other. But I think there is a discussion here about whether that process of invigoration or empowerment or what you might want to call it is glossing over problems or whether it is solving problems, right? So in terms of populism, you show, Marlene, that in the context of weak democratic institutions, economic, political problems, and so on, populism becomes powerful in creating trust in political institutions. But we also know that it's not necessarily powerful in solving those problems, right? So this inherent problem. So I encourage you to think about the relationship between what you see in the Western, Eastern European countries, the differentiation between countries, and what is that relationship between increasing trust in institutions as either invigorating political institutions or glossing over public failure. And Frédéric, I was really excited to read your paper. We found some of this in the Danish data. We found some of this reverting to ideological positions very clearly, and I think that now makes sense to me with your paper here in the presentation, how this links to polarization. But polarization, I mean, you show the American figures because they're so very easy to interpret, right? But they also show us what's the backside of polarization or the dark side of polarization, right? That polarization may be a process for creating political positions, but polarization may in its own right also, I mean, be the genesis of beliefs, right? So that we, that the political constituencies, as in the American case, choose positions simply because they are the polar opposite, rather than because they are ideologically important, right? So polarization may dictate ideology more than just make people revert to that. So I was wondering whether, I mean, you're looking at European countries, much more complex party compositions in most of these. Can you reflect on how that relationship between glossing over or invigorating democracies is going on? So perhaps, Marlene, if you'll answer, if possible, or speculate at least first.
Yeah, that's speculation. No, I don't actually think that populism can solve the problems of liberal democracy. And to be honest, I mean, when I first started out doing this paper, I wasn't expecting to find what I found. And I do strongly suspect that it's only a short-term positive effect. I would expect that in the long run, it actually will switch around again. And no, I don't think they can solve any of the problems they criticize. So, yeah.
Do you think, I mean, in your paper, you rely on the Norwegian case, right, of a long-standing, or you reference literature as sort of this idea. I was wondering, do you think that populist parties can bring people who've given up on democracy back into the fold? I mean, that would be, even if not solving problems, that would be a long-term beneficial effect.
I think they can actually reintegrate some parts of the population, but then I would say that it strongly depends on how they actually behave once they are in power. I mean, I think FRP has not been as extremist when it was actually in the government than it was before. And now I'm really not a party politics expert, but I think that's what happens to most parties. They become more moderate once they are in government. And so this can also work for populist parties. So yeah, there could be some beneficial effects on some parts of the population, but I think for the majority of the population, it's potentially in the long run, it's more detrimental than it is beneficial.
Right. All right. So not so happy a conclusion.
I'm not so optimistic.
Sadly.
No.
No. Okay. Thank you very much. sorry, Fred, do you have an answer as well? Or a speculation, at
okay,
least?
So the only answer that is left is a more positive answer. So I'll go with this one. What the results I've presented suggest is that more party polarizations is positive for democracy and is positive for citizens. Either you put it from a rational choice perspective, in the sense that the more you have a clear offer, the more citizens are likely to make clear choices. So this is obviously beneficial to democracy in that sense. And whether you put it more in terms of political sociology, and this is again my conclusion. So we know that that populist parties, they appeal to cross-pressure voters, to those who are not able to locate themselves and who mixed left values and authoritarian values. So those less sophisticated citizens who are less familiar with what happens in the political realm. Okay, that's good. But on face value, based on the results, we can be pretty much convinced that party polarization reduces this stock of conflicted, of cross-pressured voters. So in the sense that it reduces the reservoir of a conflicted voters with conflicted loyalties that radical parties are likely to appeal to, it's a positive outcome.
Right, but to a certain degree, or I mean, so is there some level? You talk about the distance between parties. Can we assume that at some point the void between the two polarized positions will create a space for the emergence of new, or you call radical parties? Or is there some sort of correlation there, you think? Or
well, you can have you can have large gaps between parties without necessarily having parties located at extremes of the political spectrum. So the more the political elite work within the details of their pledges, and the more they combine very specific issue positions on the economic dimension. For example, we know that the mainstreaming of political parties makes them look much alike in terms of the economic dimension. So the more there is a finer grain definitions of the positions, which especially on economic issues, which is the case in Nordic countries, as far as I know, which is nothing comparable to how the political elite have the same neoliberal discourse in most Western European countries. So the more you have a finer grain approach, which does not necessarily imply that parties are extreme or adopt extreme positions. So I would say this is a positive outcome, and this is positive for citizens, because it helps them develop nuanced belief systems.
great, thank you very much. Marcus, you also have a question again?
No, maybe just a partial response to your question, really, if you if you want to turn this into a general discussion. But I'm not sure. I'm not like keen to extend the session for everyone. But I will try to be brief. I mean, we have that result for quite a long time, that proportional voting systems tend to increase voting participation. And that's exactly because they offer a space for more extreme parties that pop up and sometimes disappear after they have been like a place for protest voters. Before we had populists, we had protest voting as a concept in political science, and that was the same process basically, where the frustrated people go to if the main parties don't work for them. And I think that points to a different thing that was something that was hidden in the presentations as we are talking about them a bit. We were talking as if like polarization, ideological polarization and populism were like almost the same, and I think that's not true. The kind of polarization that we see, for example, in the US is like more deep entrenchment, but I'm not so sure about the ideological consistency, at least on the right side of the spectrum. There's a different process. And then again, that's a majoritarian system. as we have in the UK, where actually the main populist is the leader of the Conservative Party. I think there's this conditionality on the other events you have in the system, and that's what I wanted to remind you of.
Thank you very much for reminding me. That's, of course, a very good and important point. Nicola, you have a question as well?
Yes, I agree with the last remark by Marcus, but I have a question for Frédéric and also for Marlene. For Frédéric, I think that I really appreciate your paper because it strengthens other researches about, for example, the role of party system polarization in interacting with the left-right distance in the vote choice function. And other researchers show that indeed the party system polarization strengthen the importance of left-right ideological voting. And this is in line with your findings, so I agree a lot. But I have another question. Because you have controlled the explanatory role of ideological polarizations towards ideological consistencies, and this is correct. I wonder if you can, for another research, of course, if you want to check also the role of valence issues, because, of course, in your paper you have worked on positional issues, clearly. But I think that when there is, my idea is that when there is less polarization, maybe the role of valence issues is more important. And this is related also with the rise, maybe, of some populist parties and leaders that use valence issues, non-ideological issues. I was thinking about the role played by Five Star Movement in Italy. They played a lot on valence issues. And of course, also on some positional issues, but especially on valence, non-ideological issues. And this is also related to the question that I want to ask to Marlene. That it is not about your work, but in general with the label populism, because I've seen that under this umbrella, there is a lot of different things. So maybe I'm not so in favor of using populism, maybe challenger parties, because I've seen that in some countries there are parties that are just radical right parties, or then populist. Or if you distinguish between left wing and the right wing, then you miss some non-ideological populist parties, maybe. So just I have just some doubts regarding the label, but that's okay.
Frédéric, do you want to respond first?
Yeah, we checked for valence, but we also checked for the effect of dimensionality, which may be a more important issue to control for. There is what could to put it clearly, what could influence the consistency in belief systems can also be the dimensionality of the party systems, meaning by that whether it's uni or bidimensional, and we control for that, and and the results findings show that polarization is more important than dimensionality, which largely converge or is corroborated by data showing that what citizens pay attention is more to cues focusing on heterogeneity between parties than cues focusing on consistency within parties. So it connects to the literature on distinctiveness and on how partisans use cues to maintain intergroup distinctiveness. So basically, it's more a matter of what matters more is how parties manage to differentiate from each other than whether they are fully consistent on one issue. So it's more inter-party differences than within-party consistency.
Thank you very much. And Marlene, do you feel up to unraveling the spaghetti bowl of populism?
No, but yeah, I mean, I'm not a populism scholar, so I just follow sort of the mainstream, and I follow whatever the populist. I mean, that's Matthijs Rodijn and et al. So they classify them as populists, and they actually also distinguish them from I think extremist parties. So they don't include all right-wing or left-wing parties. So I think that's maybe some indication that there is something to it. Yeah, I can't really the terminology here. That's, I think, a discussion for a whole nother seminar, and I don't feel up to it because it's not my turf at all. So I can't really give a qualified comment on that. Sorry.
Yeah, and if I may add to what Marlene say, the populism studies are evolving a lot, and they have evolved recently, and they have somewhat entered a second generation of scholars who pay more attention to what happens when populist parties are in government, which is something that was mentioned earlier, and they also pay attention to what happens to citizens when the political supply is large, when you have at the same time a supply from left-wing populist parties and right-wing populist parties, which is the case in France. So citizens do not respond the same depending on whether there is only a right-wing populist party or right-wing populist party plus left-wing populist party. And when populist parties enter government and when they are in office, what is expected is that voters develop more utilitarian considerations. So they expect gains from the governments they have voted for when they are in office.
All right. So there are no more hands in my participants field. Anyone up for a last question? If not, I think we did good work here today. In particular, Marlene and Frédéric, thank you very much for extremely interesting and thought-provoking presentations and papers that fitted excitingly well together, I think. So thank you very much. You get a virtual round of applause for your presentation. And also to everyone for participating in this seminar. It was, as I mentioned at the beginning, our first, and we hope to make more. I think if we can build on this experience, it's going to be a huge success. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a nice weekend.
So thank you from my side to Frédéric and Marlene for accepting our invitation, and particular thank you to all of you that decided to, let's say, take a break from refreshing news today and join this webinar and this discussion. I think that is important for us as a scientific community to keep meeting, discussing, and especially keeping open the scientific exchanges. I think that this is a moment we all need this, and thank you very much for joining also from different parts of Europe and beyond. So thank you very much, and we will keep you posted about our activities. So bye.
Thanks to the organizers, and Morten, enjoy the swim.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's going to be cold. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.